For thousands of years, civilization has been a destructive force, both ecologically and culturally. Deep in the abyss of the sixth extinction, the future of humanity and our other-than-human kin hangs by a thread. At this pivotal moment in time, we must reach back into the depths of the human story and uncover our mistakes. I invite you to go with me down the rabbit hole as I seek out the silenced, forgotten, buried, abandoned, and demonized stories and practices of regenerative, egalitarian, place-based cultures. There is still time to reconnect with what we have lost, to restore our broken relationships to the land where we dwell, and to remember the human place in the wild. Hello, and welcome to the Rewilding podcast. I'm your host, Peter Michael Bauer. I'm coming to you from Portland, Oregon, the traditional territory of the Multnomah and Clackamas Chinookan people, as well as the Kalapuya, Molalla, Cowlitz, and many other tribal groups whom have lived here, subsisted here, and traveled here to trade and make their living since time immemorial. This podcast is produced in partnership with Rewild Portland, a nonprofit organization, and is made possible through financial support from our listeners. The best way to keep the podcast going is to become a recurring monthly supporter. If you feel inspired to contribute, you can make a donation by following the link in the podcast notes. You can also help by sharing our podcast on social media and writing us a review on iTunes. Today's episode is on the institution of anthropology and a couple of my problems with it. I really have wanted to interview my friend Josh as well as my friend Fern for a long time. And considering that they both know each other, I decided to just have us all three have a conversation. So without kind of getting too much into it, which we will do in the conversation, I'm just going to go ahead and jump right in. I had a few technical difficulties, and Fern ended up editing the podcast together for us. So I just want to also give a shout out to Fern for making this happen.
Cool. Yeah, nice to see you both.
Nice to see you.
This will be a fun and interesting conversation, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm.
In the vein of doing this very sort of on the fly and not with a lot of planning, I realized that I'm probably just going to have you both introduce yourselves. It's like the lazy version of a podcast. So I guess, Fern, do you want to introduce yourself first and then Josh?
Yeah, sure. My name is Fern, and I grew up in Australia. I'm living at the moment in the United States. And I guess the piece of information of relevance for this interview is that after spending a lot of time in and out of different schooling institutions, I'm at the moment halfway through a PhD in anthropology at Columbia University in New York, which is a thing that I'm sure we'll talk a lot more about.
Cool. I'm Josh Sterlin, and also through, the process of having gone in and out of multiple educational institutions, including the Wilderness Awareness School out there on your guys' coast. I am now halfway through a PhD, not in anthropology, though my background's in environmental anthropology, at McGill University here in Montreal, Canada. And the university I presently go to and that Fern previously went to, McGill, is actually built on an Iroquois settlement of Hochelaga. So I thought that I should probably say that off the top.
Cool. Yeah, I've had this thing. Obviously I've been wanting to interview both of you for a while and just in a different way. I feel like this is going to be interesting, more like a conversation than the classic sort of interviews that I've been doing. But I have two things that are kind of more like three things that are sort of like simmering in regard to anthropology, academia. And, the first thing that came up recently was, I started calling myself an anthropologist, and I have no degree. I'm a high school dropout. And this friend of mine on Facebook private messaged me and was like, you can't call yourself an anthropologist. You don't have a degree. And that sort of led into this long conversation about what I would like to talk with y'all about here today, which is sort of, what is anthropology and who is anthropology, as well as, just the ethics around anthropology as a whole. When I introduce the Rewilding 101 class, I do this thing now called an anthropology apology, which is probably also the title of this interview or conversation. And it's basically based off, I used to do all these talks at Echoes in Time and other ancestral skills gatherings. And I mentioned in one of them that a lot of the information that we know in regard that I use for rewilding conversations and, a lot of the information that forms the narrative comes from anthropology and archaeology. And that, that's a very fraught field. And a lot of the, there's a lot of laws and things like that against, for example, digging up remains or especially with archaeology and things like that nowadays. But before there wasn't so much. And so it was kind of like a free reign digging up other people's land for like acquiring information for civilization, and the negative cultural impacts of that process, right? And so I have this anthropology apology that is reflected because this woman, Jessica, mentioned to me that there was this medical book created by the Nazis of illustrations of the interior of people's bodies, and it's still considered one of the best books for surgeons to like look at to see what they're cutting into and understand the layering within the human body. And it wasn't until years after it came out that it was actually revealed that the majority of the illustrations in the book were victims of the Holocaust. And so the book went out of print for a long time, and I think they've revived it, but with an introduction that basically says, this information was gleaned through really horrible practices, and we want to make that clear as a way of, being able to continue this, printing this edition, because it's important that their lives meant something, and this is very valuable, and this information can save lives. And so we recognize that it was like, at the same time, brought about from this sort of like horrible history. And so, when I was mentioning those kinds of things and their relevance to anthropology, she was like, do you do like a disclaimer before your talks, about the history of anthropology and archaeology? And I was like, no, but that's a really good thing that I would like to start doing. And so from then on, I've done what I call the anthropology apology, which is basically like saying this, a lot of this information comes from a colonial context where anthropologists were mining and archaeologists were mining this information. And there's been a lot of improvements. Obviously, we'll talk about some of that stuff in this conversation. And at the same time, there are still people engaged in really horrible practices on a regular basis all over the place. And so just kind of wanting to, jump into, what is anthropology? Who is anthropology? And then what are the ethics that make it a benefit to society without at the same time working against itself and doing damage to other people? So that's kind of where I want to go in the conversation. So maybe we can start off by just kind of talking about what is anthropology to you, and to a larger context, how do you see it in that regard?
Yeah, it's such a fraught history, the history of the discipline of anthropology, and in some ways it's almost a wonder that people are still using the word, but which is the thing that I'll get to. But one of the things that I've been thinking about lately is in terms of the colonial history of anthropology, and the ways in which it contributed to the project of colonialism. I think one of the things that you touched on, Peter, in what you were talking about with the anthropology apology, is that there's a lot of data and knowledge that was generated through the practice of anthropology and by anthropologists that served in the colonization of, particular continents or nation states. And so in some ways it facilitated that project through kind of like quite material practices of gathering knowledge. But there's also an epistemological aspect to how anthropology forwarded the colonial project, which was that I think in many ways it contributed to the kind of illusory and violent division between subject and object, where the colonial actor was seen as exclusively in the position of the subject, meaning the colonizer had agency, was able to know the world and generate knowledge and pass it on about the other. And the other in early anthropology was always the indigenous person, right? And they were cast into the position of object, meaning that which could be known, but that which could not know the other. So this is something that, I think that part of the reason why anthropology as a discipline to a certain extent redeemed itself is that through the 1980s especially, but even previously to that, like in the early 70s, you have anthropologists like Talal Asad writing about the role of anthropology within colonialism. But you have this kind of reflexive turn where anthropology looked into itself as an actor within the colonial process, and thought critically and long and hard, and in ways that are still continuing, about whether certain anthropological practices could in fact be repurposed in a way, kind of like scavenged and repurposed for anti-colonial liberation. And so maybe that's a thing that we can talk more about later in the conversation. Maybe I'm kind of curious what Joshua has to say, actually.
Yeah, thanks, Fern. I've always thought of the past few decades of the anthropological project as a sort of perpetual reflexive hand-wringing that the discipline is engaged in. It's been quite the project to encounter its own history, honestly, and its alliance with colonialism. Really, it's a child of colonialism itself. Along the same lines as what Fern was saying, when the other was, cast against the sort of European imagination, right? It was either dehumanized or, and I think we sort of see this now as we've tried to, expand the notion of the human throughout the world to, notions of equality, of sameness. You see it, in the term Anthropocene, where there's a sort of, in a way, a colonial expansion of the very notion of what it means to be human. And I think a lot of the people that anthropology would have, quote unquote, traditionally studied wouldn't agree with, the notion of the anthropos, of the central figure of the human. But I do think that, like Fern was saying, that the discipline holds out the decolonial hope. It has the potential, I think, in its best moments, to open up what we might mean by the human and what we might mean by living as a human among non-humans. Because, it takes in all cases of humans, it purports to, at least, right? So it tries to see what it might mean to be a person in the world in all possible ways that people think and live and do and be. And I think there's a lot of potential in that place. And I think you, Peter, draw a lot on that in your work.
Totally. Yeah, awesome. It's interesting to me to hear that there's this sort of, perpetual hand-wringing kind of thing. And I feel like there's maybe two sides, and there's one side that does that, and then there's another side that still just continues to not give a fuck. And, I think about, of course, the worst, most known figure within that context, Napoleon Chagnon, or however you say his last name, author of Yanomami, the Fierce People, who went to South America and in his time there gave weapons to the people he was studying, and then, broke a bunch of their taboos while interviewing them in order to create conflict, and then went ahead and wrote after the fact about how humans are innately violent and this group of indigenous people was innately violent, without recognizing that he himself created that situation. And there were plenty of anthropologists who were there before and during and after who witnessed the rise in violence from his presence, even so much to write books in response to it. And yet he was still elected to the Academy of, the National Academy of Sciences not very long ago before his death, So it's like this interesting thing where I feel like even though there's an ethics board now within academia, even academia itself isn't holding itself to those standards, which is just bizarre. So how is there, what are you seeing as two people who are in academia? Like, is there a struggle going on within that context? Like, who created these ethics, and then why are they not actually being followed? Like, where is the accountability if, what's the point of creating a bunch of ethics if there's no actual accountability, I guess?
Mm-hmm. I actually was recently filling out the Canadian government's required ethical review board. One of the examples of unethical behavior was Napoleon Chagnaw. It was one of the actual questions. So it's made its way into the ethics review board procedure. But I mean, it seems to me that much of the sort of bureaucratization of ethics that has developed around this seems to mostly, try to protect in a sort of legalistic fashion the interests of universities, the interests of researchers, or the interests of quote unquote informants or research subjects, etc. Whatever terminology is used in the research ethics board's procedures. But I think fundamentally, and I think really, really importantly for anthropology itself, is it's not the central question that's really not asked is, what is your ethical responsibility to the people you study with and to the non-humans you study with? And that, I think, is the true ethical question. What is the purpose of the knowledge creation and the knowledge process, rather than sort of, an abstract, maybe, Enlightenment ideal of abstract knowledge? And I think, those are the true ethical questions that are kind of overlooked in this central bureaucratization of morality.
Yeah, and I think there are a few things coming to my mind, just building on what Joshua has said just now, and then your description, Joshua, of the kind of reflexive hand-wringing that perpetually plagues anthropologists, I think. In terms of the bureaucratization of ethics, which I think is a really good way of framing it, I think on the one hand, it's the upshot of the kinds of cases that you've both mentioned. The Nazi Party's examination of the bodies of prisoners and Holocaust victims is something that, similarly to you, Joshua, I was recently filling out Columbia University's Institutional Review Board ethics process, and that was an example that came up with it, was the fact that the Nazi Party used the bodies of prisoners to generate medical knowledge. And so that found these kinds of ethical reflexes now that are enshrined into the institution of the university. And I think because anthropology's own reflexive history is so particular, that anthropology as a discipline went through these processes through the 70s of looking into itself as a discipline and its own history, I think that anthropology has its own particular set of ethical requirements, at least on paper. So for instance, one of the things that I recently learned is that when a journalist writes an article about whatever and uses interviews with people, it's best practice for journalism to publish that article without checking with the people who are interviewed, right? At least on paper, for anthropologists, we would never do that. Ideally, the process is collaborative and people get to weigh in on the ways in which they factor into how anthropologists are thinking and writing and representing others. So all of that part of anthropology is in some ways, enshrined in protocols. But I think on the other hand, those protocols are not enough, because when they become bureaucratized and when they start to roll out at the level of the institution, they're never contextually specific and they don't shift with time. And so I think in some ways, all of this paperwork that we need to fill out in order to go to quote unquote the field or talk with people or publish or whatnot, it's not dynamic and it doesn't meaningfully incorporate the interests of the people that we're working with.
I think one of the sources for hope within the anthropological discipline is the increasing returning of the anthropological gaze by Indigenous peoples and peoples it studies, sort of very consciously, very specifically, and very loudly and politically. I think there are increasing amounts of Indigenous anthropologists, for instance, speaking back to the discipline and returning the gaze. And I think that really holds out a potential really generative future for the discipline, which I think should be, I don't know, spoken of more loudly potentially.
Totally. Yeah, that was something that Dave Lewis, I think, mentioned too in my interview with him. And he's a PhD anthropologist and native person here in Portland. Well, the Northwest, I should say. But yeah, that's and that actually reminds me of the other thing which I was going to bring up to Fern, which is you mentioned this concept of object and subject, and this idea of an anthropologist going out and studying a people makes me think of in the book The Invention of Culture. There's a new introduction in it by Tim Ingold, and he talks about how maybe it's actually part of the book. I know it's been so long since I read it, but there's this idea of anthropology basically is just studying the differences between people, like asking the question, how am I different than this other person? And I think that there's some inherent problem in that, like you were saying, with object and subject. And even though there was maybe this internal investigation of anthropology as itself, it feels like that's still the kind of framework that it's set up to do. And so even though there are more ethics around that, there's still this kind of embodiment of alienation when you're going to study another people for university or something. It makes me think of what you were saying, Josh, in regard to, it's essentially like a colonial gaze that can go both ways depending on who is the one looking, but it basically creates an automatic division between people rather than a collaborative one. And so where is, as a field that is supposed to be in terms of scientific inquiry objective, but also at the same time recognizing that there is no such thing as objectivity in this regard, and that the interviewer has their own bias and all of those things in that regard. Has anthropology, in the ways that you've experienced it within academia, does it address any of that stuff? Because it feels like from my end, when I'm engaging with people who are in academia with anthropology, there's still this kind of us and them, subject, object, I don't know, an example, for me, that is that a few years back, there was a anthropologist, somebody going to get their master's in anthropology. They wanted to come to Portland and study Rewild Portland. And I love that idea. I love the field of anthropology. In spite of its challenges, I've gotten so much out of it in my life. And the idea of having somebody come here and learn about what we're up to and then write about it seemed super exciting. And then they got here and they lived in Portland for a year and came to a lot of our events, volunteered for some things, essentially became what I would consider to be a friend. At the same time, there were a lot of people in the community who didn't like this person, and they stopped coming to certain events because they knew this person was going to be there. And so already you have this this person who's perceiving the community and culture in a way that it doesn't actually exist without their presence. Their presence in and of itself was a disruption on the community. But if they had just been a regular person that was coming to the events, it wouldn't have really mattered in regard to the study of Rewild Portland or something like that. And it ended up being, they eventually left, and years went by where I was constantly messaging them, not constantly, but every once in a while being like, hey, did you finish your paper? And they were like, no, I haven't finished it yet. No, I haven't finished it yet. No. Eventually it became kind of worrisome, okay, well, clearly, it looked like on their Facebook, they had got their degree already, certain things. And eventually we figured out that she had submitted it, didn't check in with us about any of the stuff that she wrote. And when we finally got a hold of it, it was filled with, basically she had either made up quotes from members of our community, a la Jared Diamond, or she had been secretly recording us, against what she said and against what I had signed on any kind of, form or whatever. And that was because at that point she was already deeply connected on a level, that we didn't even really think to ask any of those questions. Like the fact that she was writing about this particular thing that was very personal to all of us, that had nothing to do with the organization Rewild Portland, but everything to do with our community that is around that and feeds into it. It was essentially like a grief ritual that we led together as a community, not as an organization, for a small number of people that had nothing to do with the organization at all. And, there's this person there secretly recording that we're all just assuming is one of our friends at this point, and then disappears, doesn't talk to us for years. And then we find out she's actually submitted this thing, which I know actually I've talked to you both a little bit about this. And then, of course, already there's this separation going on there between, her being a study, like, is she my friend or is she a anthropologist there who's just there to write about us and then leave, right? And so that was like, just on a personal level, super conflicting and weird. And then for her to then go and lie about us and come up with this thesis that was based around how much white guilt we're all suffering from, which was like the core of her thesis, which was not something she ever really asked us about, and we would heavily disagree with a lot of the things that she was projecting onto us as individuals and as community members and as an organization. And then, our response was to go to her university and say, like, this person illegally or like secretly recorded us or made up quotes about us and wrote this whole paper based on an idea she never actually spoke with us about. Like, we want there to be, we would like some justice around this. And the response has just been a continuous ignoring. And then eventually, they said, we had our review board look through it and we found that she did nothing wrong. And so it's interesting to kind of have this, like, for me, I'm not in academia, but I'm adjacent. And I consider myself an anthropologist in the sense of, like, I am in the larger context of what anthropology means outside of academia. If academia owns the term anthropology and I'm not allowed to say it, then what is the point of expanding the concept of it to be this other framework? But then if they expand that, they lose the authority around it in that context, right? There's just like a lot of a mess in that whole thing, right? And so I know both of you have talked about that or heard of this story, but can you speak to it in where are your thoughts going with this situation? And, like, this is a very personal situation, but I'm sure that this extends out into the rest of the field, right? So even though we weren't, it's nowhere on par with what Napoleon Chagnon, I still don't know how to say his name, did to the Yanomami. It's still the same kind of, like, principle, right? Where there's really no delineation, like there's this imposition, there's a misunderstanding based on their own perceptions of what's happening. And there's people in the background, like I said, that weren't coming to events because this person was there and they didn't like her. There was even a moment where she complained that people weren't talking to her because they were afraid she was going to write about it. And then, of course, that's exactly what she did to other people who were more close to her than others, right? So it's just kind of, I don't necessarily need to be focusing on that particular instance, right? But it is one of the, like, intersections of all of the things that, all of these problematic aspects that is very also personal to me in that regard. But just overall in general, this idea of how can anthropology transcend these relationships of observer observed?
Well, I have a couple of thoughts that I can throw into the mix. The example that you raised, Peter, we've talked about it before, and it's egregious, not only to me, but I've spoken to a number of professors of anthropology about it who also are genuinely shocked by this particular story. And in some ways, I feel really gutted and disappointed that it happened at all. in other ways, in some ways, I'm kind of heartened by the general reaction of shock, because I hope that it might be more the exception than the rule. Not that I have too many stakes in defending, what anthropology is within academia, which is sort of the next point that I was wanting to think through. Which is that in some ways, I think what your story points to is a way in which we need to be critical of the university as an institution as well. Because I think, one of the unfortunate aspects of the experience that you've been through and Rewild Portland has been through with this student is that you found that the institution only really has its own back, Unfortunately, these ethics boards, as Josh was mentioning before, They may ostensibly be set up to protect the interests of people that researchers work with, but they're also set up to protect the university's own brand and reputation, in essence, and to protect the university from being sued. So they have this kind of double function, and I guess it depends, it depends how a particular case might land. I think another part of the problem is the way in which the culture of academia shapes people to approach research with a kind of careerist self-interest, and that's part of the function of education as it plays out within the university, is to shape us into individuated, competitive people who are trying to build a career on mining, as you were saying before, Peter, data from the world around us. And so in some ways, I think it's important to be really clear-eyed when we step into the institution of the university about what our interests are, who we're accountable to, and what is the purpose of our doing this thing called anthropology, which I truly believe that everyone can do and does most of the time, just without the fancy name. But what is the reason that we do it through this particular institution, and where our interests lie? So if someone is engaging in a study so that they can become a doctor for their own particular careerist ends, then I think they're unfortunately more likely to abuse the kind of power dynamics that set up that subject-object division in the first place and perpetuate them. On the other hand, some of the work that really inspired me actually to go back to grad school was this wonderful book called The Undercommons that was written by Stefano Hardy and Fred Moten, where they write about if we're stepping into academia with our interests in and not in the institution of the university, then we can see the institution of the university as a pool of resources. And these resources generally have been stolen. Most universities in colonial nation states, they occupy stolen Indigenous territories, and they hoard resources that are stolen from Indigenous peoples. And so one of the things that quote unquote radical academics can do is to have their interest in the world around them and not in the institution of the university, but to use their research as a way to channel those stolen resources into other worlds. And I think that this is one of the ways, in fact, that anthropology can be redeemed, is that anthropologists always have a foot in both worlds. But yeah, anthropologists are always within and outside of the university. And so I think in some ways they can act, in the best instances, they can act as these kinds of channels.
Yeah, there's a lot there. So interestingly, and by a sort of strange twist of fate, my PhD is actually in natural resource sciences department. So I'm actually surrounded by natural scientists a lot of the time. And it's a particularly interesting place for an environmental anthropologist to be, because I think anthropology sees itself as very upfront about its positionality and about the ways in which it affects, let's say, the quote unquote like results of its research, right? Because it like Fern was saying, it's impossible to ignore the fact that you're a single person out in the world having relationships with other people, right? So, I've heard you say many times about Jane Goodall's effect on her chimpanzee studies. I think natural science is very reticent to be upfront about the ways in which their proposed and imagined objectivity actually affects their research. And I think anthropology thinks of itself as much more honest. whether or not I think it is in some ways much more honest in that respect, but it certainly has more to go. But I do think that the idea of sort of there's a term called strong objectivity, which is sort of like phrasing and being very upfront about your intentions, your purposes, your positionality, your place, right? Because there's no world in which your biases don't affect your research. It's impossible. You are the research instrument in some ways. Whatever your methodology is, it's impossible to like elide that. So I think that is perhaps the closest to an objectivity that is even possible, is to be utterly honest about what your intentions are, right? And it's obvious that that wasn't the case in your situation, which is, I think I echo Fern's sentiment. I think if I said that to any professor of anthropology that at least I know, they would be horrified. And I mean, I think further, I remember reading a paper coming out of, I don't remember the author specifically, but the question was, is anthropology primarily an extractivist discipline, and are we the real monsters? And I mean, I think that's a question that anthropology really has been wrestling with and continues to wrestle with and needs to wrestle with. We may be, as institutional disciplinary figures, we like to think of ourselves as sort of, at the edge of empire, attempting to mitigate the overwhelming colonial forces. But I mean, to what degree has anthropology been radically complicit with that project? Yeah, I think Fern and I are both trying to think into a place of anthropological redemption.
I mean, yeah, and that kind of segues into the next sort of thread of this, which to me, like, I feel like I'm doing the same thing, but outside of the context of academia, where, in a sense, anthropology, where the rubber meets the road, you know what I mean? It's like, how do you then apply this knowledge to shape culture, which I think there's an aspect of, like, even in, it makes me think of like environmental sciences, where with anthropology, it almost seems like there was in a sense, it's like writing an ethnography more than anything, where it's just like information that sits on a shelf, but doesn't then get applied to the way we live our lives. In the same way, like, I think there's an environmental science where it's actually just underlying, there's an implication that we're studying this knowledge so that we can use it in some way in the real world, right? But with anthropology, it's kind of like not really thought of in that regard. It's kind of like we're just having this like study that then will sit up on a shelf. Like, we're going to, do this archaeological dig so that we can understand how these people lived. And then that's kind of it. That's the end of it, rather than seeing it as a dynamic thing where what's the point of doing the study at all if it's not somehow going to improve, or not necessarily improve, but affect the way we live our lives. And so when I see, what I think about in terms of what I do is like anthropology, there's the field of academic research of anthropology. And then there's like, where that trickles out of that particular setting and into the world where people are making decisions about the way they're running their lives or living their lives. And I think, I kind of linguistically, I want to be like, it's like embodied anthropology in a sense, but so is the study itself. It's just two sides of a different kind of embodiment of anthropology. I think for me, I was thinking about this a lot when this woman, rejected me being able to call myself an anthropologist because I don't have an anthropology degree, right? I started thinking about all these things. But for me, what I'm doing is anthropology, and it hurt my feelings in a way that while I see the awesome things coming out of the academia of anthropology, or the academic anthropology, there's no reflection there. Like, there isn't an academia that looks out at what I do and says, oh, this person is like doing another part of the anthropology that is the same part of what we're doing. We're working together on a shared vision. But rather, that person is doing something out of the anthropological context in a way that we think is maybe unscientific or whatever, to this level where we're going to reject their label. And in thinking about all this, I'm thinking, what is the point of me calling myself an anthropologist? Like, why am I doing it, right? And I started thinking, and for the longest time I haven't called myself that. I don't know what I don't really have a thing to call myself. Pretentiously, I think for the long time I've just called myself an autodidact because it sounds cooler than a dropout. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And people don't know what it means, so they think you sound smart, right? So it's kind of like this inversion of the judgment that you're going to experience when you tell people you've never gone to traditional schooling, you don't have a traditional education. Traditional meaning academic, actual traditional meaning, the time before there were schools. But in that regard, I'm thinking, like, what is one of the things she said to me was like, I didn't go to school for 7 years and spend thousands of dollars, like just so anybody could call themselves an anthropologist, basically, right? Like, she was essentially saying, and my flippant response was like, well, not everybody has to buy a piece of paper for their credibility, like that kind of thing. And she's like, well, I did a lot of work, and you're saying I just bought this thing, so there's this argument going on, but there's kind of like a context there of, it makes me think of classism, superiority, like that the academic institution thinks of itself in this superior context to what's actually happening on the ground with the information that they are getting from different cultures. And so to me, it's like basically what I came down to is my feelings were hurt for not being seen and being, I think part of the word itself is this idea of belonging. People want to belong to a thing, right? And so I think in her regard, what she was saying was like, I didn't spend all this time doing field research and spending all this money so I could belong to this group, whereas other people could just start saying they belong to it too without having to do any of the same kinds of hoops that I had to jump through, was essentially, I think, what she was saying in this way. And so it just made me think a lot about the idea of belonging and how funny it is. I have no, at the end of the conversation, I was basically like, as soon as I piss off enough anthropologists, I'm going to just stop calling myself an anthropologist because I don't really care, right? It's not really about that. I think on some level, there's just like a part of me that is an iconoclast and I just want to annoy people and their institutions in that regard. But really, another thing that she said was people can tell the difference between people who have a degree and those who don't. And I thought that was so funny because that's actually one of the reasons why I started calling myself an anthropologist, was because after 20 years, people just assume I'm one. And when I, and they'll call me one. And I've, over the last 20 years, I've been like, actually, I'm not an anthropologist. Like, I didn't get a degree, or whatever. And people are like, no, I mean, like, you're an anthropologist, even if you didn't get it, So eventually, like, I just have embraced that identity. And of course, the identity is what creates this like sense of belonging. And it's just interesting to see the sort of interpersonal conflict of labels and identity and belonging in that way, where for me, my feelings are hurt because I'm feeling rejected in a way, even though I've spent my entire life dedicated to the field of anthropology, not just as an educator, but also as somebody, again, I feel like I've embodied the practice in a way that I feel eliminates subject object and is more about creating interpersonal relationships and cross-cultural bridges. So again, like, and so one of the things I did too is I went online and I looked up like, okay, so, what are the top 10 careers of people who get an anthropology degree? And so I'm looking at those 10 careers and I'm like, every single one, except for a lawyer or a medical doctor, I do. It's like social media manager. Okay, well, I do that. And that's kind of a bullshit thing, right? But like nonprofit executive director, like that's what I do for a living, and then there's like being a teacher in some sort of institution, which I do. And I teach paleoanthropology and anthropology and archaeology and all these things. Another one was like a diplomat, a cross-cultural diplomat. And I'm like, that's literally what Rewild Portland is doing and all these different things. So it's just interesting to see like that all these job descriptions of what anthropologists, people who get anthropology degrees go on to do, is that embodied anthropology? If so, I do embody that definition of it. If not, then, is it really just getting this piece of paper? So then I look into what it would take for me to get an anthropology degree. And right now, it's obvious there are schools that, because I'm older and I have all this life experience, there are schools I can go to where I can pay money and they will just essentially give you what are called life credits. So I could go and pay a whole bunch of money to get life credits at universities, to then start, my own. The second half of my degree would be actual, reporting on the things I'm doing. But I could build my own degree around the sciences, which would actually just be, again, what I already do and what I've been doing for the last 15 years or so, right? So basically, I could get an anthropology degree by literally just paying a university money to continue doing what I've already been doing, right? So then there's a level of like, why am I ranting about all of this? I'm thinking about this is what I'm thinking too. And why do I want to have a conversation with both of you about this in regard to my like personal feelings? And I'm like, am I looking for an authority in the field of academia to like approve of what I'm doing and say, yes, Peter, what you're doing is anthropology? And is that then in and of itself me still looking to academia as a form of authority? Or is it, you know what I mean? So it's just funny kind of like trying to break down the whole sort of emotional context of this word and of this larger field. And I think there's a level of wanting, I feel like there's an emotional level of wanting to connect with you two around this as a way of creating that bridge of belonging and expanding this idea of what anthropology can be beyond academia. So I don't know, what are your thoughts on all of that rambling?
Well, I don't think either Fern and I would consider ourselves authorities, so sorry. But yeah, I mean, I got a lot to say on this subject. I think that the whole premise of the discipline of anthropology is studying the different ways of being human, and to try and to purport to discount other forms of knowledge creation outside of the academy is almost like a contradiction with the disciplinary project itself. And I think it's really actually overlooking a huge thing, which is that what you do, Peter, and what people like you in the larger Rewilding community, I've been thinking of it as a sort of experimental anthropology in the way that like experimental archaeology works, right? You're taking all of this, purported objective, knowledge out of the ethnographic and archaeological records, and you're trying to sort of look for best practices. You're trying to, live anthropology into the world. And that's something that I think the discipline's been very reticent to do for a long time now. And I mean, there are reasons, as we've been, talked to for the first half of this conversation, anthropology's used this knowledge for a lot of terrible things in the past, or other people have used anthropological knowledge. So it's been really reticent to make any prescriptive claims. But I mean, I think that in some ways, like the freedom you have as a person not, attached to this stuffy institution to sort of like do all of this experimental work that really like broadens the discipline in a lot of ways, I think is extremely insightful, and it the academy in some ways holds people like us back from saying things and from doing certain types of research. And I think particularly what people like you do, I think so. You talked about Tim Ingold before, and he once referred to anthropology as philosophy with the people in. You do, I think, rewilding with the people in, right? And I think you're really answering a lot of the calls, or you already have been answering for a long time, calls within the academy now, which are like, how can we learn to be with the earth again, right? How can we learn to relate to the more than human world in a way that is mutually enhancing and not destructive, right? And you've already been doing that for your entire career, right? And already using anthropological knowledge to do that. So, I mean, whether or not you're an anthropologist is almost like besides the point, in that like you are pushing the edges of the discipline, and you're answering calls that anthropology is only recently, let's say, trying to answer. So I'll leave it there. I'll give it to Fern.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's so exciting to think this true with the both of you, because I think things that came to mind as you were speaking, Peter, is that I think that anthropology at its best is treacherous to the institution of the university. You know, like when, in my opinion, and this is one of the reasons that I still, you know, am within the discipline of anthropology, and I use discipline in scare quotes, is that I think that anthropology has the capacity to betray the capitalist institution of the university and, you know, like the parts of society that that are egregious, that have gotten us to the point of, you know, being within the sixth mass extinction and, you know, have other founding causes of the Anthropocene. And I think about, you know, one of the things that I read before I made the decision to go back to grad school in anthropology was David Graeber's Fragments of an Anarchist Anthropology, where he makes the argument that one of the things that anthropology can do in the world, not in the institution, but in the world, is to show that parts of our reality, and I'm using our to refer specifically to the three of us, that we might be able to take for granted, like the state, like commodity capitalism, they're actually not inevitable. And actually, for the vast majority of human history, we've been living without these institutions. And I think this is something that you push in your work, Peter, that you've taken from anthropology and from, you know, a number of other places in the world, and that you're using your work to platform. So I think in some sense, that's one of the things that I find hopeful within anthropology, is the fact that it can undermine, you know, some of the institutions have founded it.
I'll just pick up on Fern's flagging of the you know, putting discipline in scare quotes. I mean, I think that speaks to something you were saying before, Peter, which is, you know, the academy in many ways is the disciplining of thought, and the disciplining of speech, and the disciplining of, you know, embodiment. Some of which potentially is, you know, for good reasons. It's important to be rigorous and so on, but in some of which is the sort of occlusion and the you know, the putting off limits of certain ways of being, certain ways of speaking, certain ways of thinking. And so in some ways you're very free of that, the discipline that Fern and I have sort of put on our own shoulders and, you know, wrestle with daily in the academy and try to subvert, and right. And yeah, I mean, I think I take a lot of inspiration, like Fern, from the sort of radical anthropological tradition, like those, like the recently passed David Graeber, you know, Pierre Clastre, James C. Scott, who's not, you know, technically an anthropologist, but this sort of like anarchistic tradition of anthropology of trying to show the relativity of our own way of being, right? And the fact that everything that we take for granted, all of, you know, the state, empire, colonialism, domestication, you know, materialism, are all historically contingent realities. They're not necessarily ontologically objective, right? So it opens all, anthropology, I think, in its most radical format, opens all of this space to be otherwise and to relate otherwise, which we definitely need right now.
Totally. It's interesting, too. It makes me think of, like, you know, university academia as an arm of the state, of course, is going to hate, you know, when you were talking about how much more freedom I might have versus the discipline of academia, it makes me think of, like, you know, the like propaganda. The phrase that popped into my head was, I think, like in George W. Bush's voice, like, they hate us for our freedom or something. You know, like, it just makes me think of, like, that kind of, I mean, although that was, you know, a complete fabrication, it makes me think of that sort of idea of how much the state in and of itself hates people who have this kind of freedom that exists outside of its control. And I think that maybe that's some of the deeper seated feelings among people who might want to protect their concept of what anthropology is from the institutional framework against somebody like me who has his freedom. In a sense, it might be stemming from a sense of jealousy. You know, I don't know. I'm not just projecting ideas here. But, you know, in the sense that is frustrating to somebody, you know, that somebody outside the institution could call themselves an anthropologist. And then the mirror of that is me feeling sad that I am rejected from the institution, but at the same time, I reject the institution. So how, you know, I've never been able to participate in schooling. You know, I dropped out of high school when I was 16. I thought it would be awesome to go and get an anthropology degree. So 3 years later, when I was 19, I did like placement tests at a community college, and I signed up for 2 classes. One was called Anthropology of the Northwest Coast of North America, and the other was Anthropology, weird name. It was like Native American Indian History. It was like a little redundant. It could have just been Native American history, but Native American Indian history. And it was just interesting because I knew more than the teachers about relevant contemporary anthropology, because in the 3 years of dropping out of high school and signing up for these college courses, I had read as much as I could about contemporary anthropology. Obviously, Daniel Quinn's work was heavily influential on me, so I went and looked at his reading list, and Limited Wants, Unlimited Means was one of the first books I read after Ishmael. So I was like, reading all kinds of things. And then again, Northwest Coast of North America, I had read quite a bit. And I just remember getting in these arguments with the professors about things I could articulate now, but couldn't back then, but understood a deeper level. I mean, one of the professors was making fun of animism as a belief system that everything has a spirit, which is sort of like the older, dictionary definition of anthropology. And I was coming at it from more of a Graham Harvey, Tim Ingold kind of perspective, although they hadn't written a whole bunch about it back then. So I couldn't even articulate what I was trying to say, but I knew that they were basically wrong. And I couldn't fucking handle it. So I dropped that class. That was the Northwest Coast of North America class. And then the Native American Indian history class, we had to read this book called The Patriot Chiefs. And it was like every chapter was a different Native American leader who, used different tactics to deal with colonialism. And we were supposed to write a 3 to 5 page paper comparing and contrasting King Philip to Tecumseh and their tactics in, dealing with the colonial impacts. And it was like very clear that what she was looking for was a sort of like Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, King Philip being more peaceful and economic and trade, and Tecumseh being more warlike in his, rejection of the colonial culture and stuff. But instead, I wrote a 3 to 5 page paper about how the name of the book and the concept of the book was complete bullshit, that there's no such thing as a patriot chief, and that the concept of patriotism is this like nationalistic, blah, 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 and that the word chief was misconstrued and all these different things. And that if you put them together, the title and framework of the book is actually super colonial from its foundation or whatever, right? And it should be looked at in this different way. And I remember she gave me like a C and wrote like interesting ideas, not exactly what I was looking for. And I was just like, I'm fucking done. I'm done. And, I, of course, I dropped out at that point entirely, and just kept doing my thing and kept reading and kept writing, and it's just that like desire in me to have an influence over academia through the application that we are putting into the world, so that it's not just like one directional, like I'm taking information from this field and then applying it, but how is it going back into what is happening there, if that makes any sense. Do you see that kind of thing happening? Do you see people applying anthropology outside of academia and how it affects academia? And is there an information flow or cultural exchange that's going both directions, or is it, do you know what I mean? Because I feel like there's a value there, and maybe it's just completely subjective. Maybe the institution itself isn't what will ever be held accountable, but individuals themselves who see the value in this exchange. But are there any institutional values that translate back and forth from what's being applied using that knowledge, like experimental anthropology, like you said, Josh? I don't know if that question makes any sense.
Yeah, I think I have a few different thoughts again. One is that I was reading a really interesting paper just yesterday, actually, about the Situationist International in Paris in the 60s. and how they were actually largely inspired by anthropology of the time, which was one of the things that was showing them that Western capitalist, quote unquote, modernity was not inevitable and that there were other ways to be. And so in some ways their whole movement and practice was a kind of experimental anthropology within like the urban setting of Paris in the 60s and 70s. And so I think it was an anthropology paper that I was reading about this group that had taken up anthropology for, to make radical worlds that are not that are otherwise to worlds that we find egregious. So I think that there is an interest within the field of anthropology to look at how anthropology is being used and an excitement around that. And certainly that's something that I'm really interested in my own work. And I think, it's curious. It's making me think about the story that you told before, Peter, about how someone found it controversial that you call yourself an anthropologist, or like the difficulties that you've encountered by having read enough anthropology outside of an institutional setting that you can speak back to anthropologists, with teeth. You can engage in those conversations without the piece of paper and actually challenge them enough that they feel really threatened. And part of what's really curious to me about that is I feel like, again, there's another mode of hand-wringing amongst anthropologists that like, oh, is our work relevant to the real world? Oh, we don't want to be just read within the academy or just by anthropologists. Like, we want our work to make a difference, blah, blah, blah. But then when it is taken up outside of the academy and speaks back to anthropologists, some people feel threatened by that. And so there's this sort of paradox at play there where I feel like some people talk the talk of wanting anthropology to betray the kinds of institutions that have given rise to it in some sense. But then when that dynamic actually emerges in the world, I think it can be telling as to where people's investments actually lie, and maybe sometimes that's surprising. And then the third thing that I was wanting to say that I was thinking about as you were telling some of these stories, Peter, is that I feel like anthropologists, as people who are interested in looking at the ways in which societies and structures function outside of the institution of the university, should be the people who are able to recognize that the kinds of qualities that the university hinges its prestige upon, or its authority or whatever, exist just as much outside of the university walls as within them. And I'm thinking about things like accountability, things like having quality mentorship, things like rigor of thought and practice. These are all things that are present in the way that you, Peter, have taken up anthropological work. And so, it's curious to me that an anthropologist may or may not be able to recognize those kinds of dynamics outside of the institutional walls.
Do you think that, I'm thinking here in regard to where you were kind of setting up this context of radical anthropology having the ability to, in a sense, undermine the system that has built it up. It seems like there's an interesting dynamic at play there where anthropology could undermine the very system of academia, but then academia has to continuously rein that in out of fear of it collapsing, right? Like if anthropology was followed to the furthest extent, it might actually end with the institutions themselves being dismantled, right? I mean, it makes me think of like how I constantly joke about permaculture. People oftentimes talk about how permaculture can save civilization or things like that. But if you were to actually follow permaculture to the end extremes of its design science, it would be able to like undermine the very system of civilization and create something else. And so I'm wondering, like, do you think that that's like, is that like a constant friction that you might feel as a student in academia of like feeling like it has to be reined in, or that there is some sort of like overall fear of anthropology itself kind of undermining that system? Like, I don't know if that makes sense. I'm just kind of like trying to put that thought together. But
no, that's a super interesting idea, and maybe an anthropologist should study that. I mean, in Graeber's Fragments of an Anarchist Anthropology, he says that and the discipline refuses to live up to its own potential. And I've always really liked that line because I mean, if it did, like you say, live up to its own potential, it would imagine, worlds radically different from the one, that it itself helps structure. And so, yeah, I mean, I think anthropology itself, if it was a sort of person, is perpetually feeling as a sort of like lost child, right? Perpetually sort of looking to influence things more and to get more attention, and yet also at the same time questioning itself and its own relevance. And it seems to always be sort of stuck in this place, which is super interesting. But I mean, it has also expanded its view. I mean, now there are, there's a whole field of anthropology at home where people study themselves, right? Or anthropology of the moderns, or anthropology of science, right? So, I mean, this lens has been turned on its own culture, right? And I think there's been a lot that's come out of that that's influenced sort of adjacent disciplines. And so, I mean, I think, just to speak to Graeber again, perhaps this is just, preoccupation with his recent passing, which is just, I mean, I think he really demonstrated how much in his own life and, in his political work, what the application of an anthropological mindset could be, right? He really was trying to push, right? Like, we can live differently. And that's a fact. We know that, right? There are many different ways. And I take inspiration from that.
Yeah, it makes me think, if the institution itself can't change, but anthropology is radical in the sense of creating systemic change, then the change actually happens in the real world outside of the institution. The institution can't allow itself to change. So in that sense, anthropology then has to be these two sides where it's, originated from this institution, but then ends up being created outside of it. And I just think that this conversation is definitely along the lines of what I was hoping it would be, because I feel like there's a fusion of recognizing that anthropology is this thread. And if it is like radical in the sense of envisioning a different world, that it can start to happen within a framework that, I don't think institutions will ever change. I think they're, an arm of the state, and they have the way that they function. And so in order to dismantle those systems, we have to exit them. But there's a sort of preparatory work that happens within, I think, like the institution, in leveraging its resources to see all of the imaginable worlds outside of itself, right? And then to bring that together and then exit that institution. So I feel like there's this, the leverage of power with an institution can be like a funnel or a lever, that can then project out into the world the actual changes, or the not actual, but the continuous aspect of that. And if people could recognize that anthropology isn't just a thing that is put on a shelf somewhere as knowledge, but is actually something that is then put into the world, and that there's like a connective piece there, and that we're all working toward the same end, using different aspects or working along a different side of that thread to change the world. I think that would be a much better and more welcoming idea for anthropology in and of itself. Yeah. Are there any last thoughts or questions you have for me?
I just sort of wanted to add a piece to what you just said, Peter, because I think I haven't thought about the kind of auto-destructive capacity of anthropology before, until we've been having this conversation. It's really exciting to me. Like, it reminds me of I don't actually know how to pronounce this word, but the Ouroboros, like the picture of the snake that's eating its own tail.
Oh, totally.
It reminds me a little of this image, right, where like potentially this can be the dynamic of radical anthropology put into practice, and that is something that's really exciting to me. But then it does bring us back to the question of, well, why then the university. And I think one of the things that I just wanted to add to that is that a few years ago, before I went back to grad school, I was doing a research project. It was actually an anthropological research project that I was just doing as a non-student, like on my own dime. I just, took greyhounds around the US and interviewed people. And the topic of the project was anarchist free universities. So it was these sort of like group study projects that was in essence designed to show that study occurs outside of the university and always has done and always will do, and often in ways that can be emancipatory and liberatory. But one of the people that I spoke to said a really interesting thing that stuck in my head forever, where he was like, okay, if we're fed up with the university as an institution, we can totally turn away from it and do our work in the real world, quote unquote. But it's still going to be like a dragon sitting on a pile of gold, like it still has hoarded these resources, and we just can't ignore that. So even if anthropologists using the university as a sugar daddy, their self-destructive projects that will eventually turn back on it, I think in some ways this actually can be framed as a responsible way to engage with these kinds of institutions. Like, we can have all these critiques, but I think that there's a way in which it's important actually to remain engaged with these institutions for all of their problems.
Totally.
Yeah, and I'd say I think often particular anthropologists, individuals, people who would end up in that, like Fern and I, in that disciplinary space, often I think live in a way that could be captured by Leonard Cohen's quote of "I live among you well disguised," and I think a lot of anthropologists really wrestle with these kinds of, not all obviously, but wrestle with these kinds of questions of how can they have a truly equitable anthropology, a just anthropology, right? That really serves the project of, how can we as human beings understand ourselves and our place in the world, and how can we do that in a way that is good, right? Good for all. And I think that whatever the mixed bag of our anthropological heritage is, there are at least strains of that. And I think at least that's what keeps all three of us kind of coming back and trying to mine that hoard of gold.
Yeah. Awesome. Cool. Well, thank you both for letting me pick your brains and rant at you at the same time.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Yeah.
It's really good to talk to you both.
Hope to have you back on the show again at some point.
Love to.
Would love
Thank
it.
you.
Awesome.
If you enjoyed this podcast and want to hear more, make sure to subscribe. You can support this work further by becoming a recurring supporter of my work at petermichaelbauer.com. And as always, you can help by writing a review on Apple Podcasts, and make sure to share on social media. Thank you for listening. Until next time.